Welcome very much for coming, and I just want to give you a quick introduction tonight of our speaker, Barbara Santarelli. Barbara Santarelli retired in June of this year from a career in nursing that spanned 50 uninterrupted years of employment. So just keep that in mind as you're taking your exams. You could have 40 to 50 years of work ahead of you. So she's still standing. Her nursing experience includes both in and outpatient work at Montefiore Hospital, working in home health care, and she also had a 6-month stint at Rikers Island, not as an inmate, but as a nurse. For the past 25 years before she retired, Barbara was a school nurse in the White Plains School District. She credits a cryptic sense of humor and persistent optimism to her success as a nurse. A Bronx native, Barbara has lived in Westchester County for her entire adult life and reflects on both these neighborhoods and her nursing career throughout her memoir. In addition to being a nurse and an author, Barbara is a mother, a grandmother, a cyclist, dog lover, and aspiring artist. Since retiring, she has been a contributing writer to Westchester Senior Voice magazine's blog site, has begun work on writing a second novel, spends time with her 5 grandchildren, and of course continues to work as a substitute nurse whenever called upon to do so in the White Plains School District. Everything I Never Wanted, a memoir of excess, is Barbara's debut novel and chronicles her journey to find belonging in the face of a challenging childhood. A witty and thoughtful account of her challenges, it is full of emotion as well as some uncomfortable truths. Everything I Never Wanted is a celebration of her chosen career in nursing and the importance of belonging to oneself. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Santarelli.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce, for that beautiful introduction, and Concordia for hosting the event. And mostly I have to say how grateful and honored I am to be speaking to a large group of people, not just from the community, the local community, but nursing students. You have no idea how absolutely validating it is to speak to young nurses, and I thank you for being here. I hope that the theme of this memoir, which I'll talk about, is one that speaks to you in your own lives, but I want to thank you for coming here, and I know that you're going to love being nurses. I just wish I could tell you more about that. The reality is it's very surreal for me to be here because actually, as Joyce said, for 50 years I've been a nurse and I never ever didn't work. I have 3 children. I worked out of necessity initially and then out of love. Sometimes it was not easy going to work. I've had different careers within nursing, but 50 years of nursing is a long time, which means I'm also old, but it's sort of unbelievable. But what's more unbelievable to me is that I stand here in a new career. So I decided to write this memoir several years ago, and it just began as a venting process, and I think I've written a lot on and off through my life, just recreationally, but it ended up being a memoir, and it ended up being a love story. 2 kinds of love stories, actually. So the first love story, which I'll talk about initially, is my love of my chosen career, and I'd like to go back and say how I chose that career, and I'll talk about that. And the second part of the love story is a personal love story. So you get 2 for 1 with this book. You get a professional love story and a personal love story. I think the personal one's a little juicier, so both good though. Basically, I have to say the thing about the reviews of this book, and it was well reviewed by Kirkus Reviews and Book Life, which is a publisher's weekly corporation, nicely reviewed. But my favorite review of my book was one by another memoirist who wrote that it was about a plucky girl from the Bronx. And I love that. And the reason I love that is because I love the fact that I am originally from the Bronx. And so if you're from the Bronx, I embrace my Bronx roots. I embrace the fact that being from the Bronx is nothing to be ashamed of. As a matter of fact, I'm very proud of that. And for anyone here who's from the Bronx, the reason that is I'll tell you what characteristics of the Bronx I hold most near and dear. People from the Bronx are painfully honest. They'll tell you like it is, even if you don't want to hear it. So they're honest, they're brutally honest, they're unapologetic. People from the Bronx don't apologize because they're not from Bronxville or they're not from Manhattan. There's no apologies there. I'm from the Bronx, and it's a good thing. There is something about that, and I live far away now, far away. I still live in Westchester, but it's far away. But every now and then I need to go to the Bronx and touch home. And I think people that are from the Bronx, I mean, maybe it's like that from Brooklyn, I don't know. But this girl from the Bronx speaks in this book. So one of the things I want to say about this book is that it can be rough around the edges, because I'll own up to that too. And I am not going to repeat bad words that appear in the book tonight, but it's my Bronx. And so you'll hear that Bronx girl in there. One of the things that I also think that's important is there's a tenacity about the Bronx, and there's a determination. I don't know if that determination and tenacity came so much from living in the Bronx as it did from a childhood which was less than perfect. I don't like to use the word disadvantaged. When I hear people say someone had a disadvantaged childhood, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Poor. You know, poor kid living in the ghetto, whatever. When I use the word disadvantage, I use it in a different way. Disadvantage to me means anyone who grows up feeling less than, maybe not even being less than. And for me, my childhood was one of feeling of not belonging and feeling less than, and this is why. I grew up in the 1950s. We already know I'm old, so that's okay. And an area, I love you already. Tell the patient she looks good. I grew up in an era where women didn't get divorced. So I had a single mom who was divorced, and there was a certain stigma to being a divorced woman. And my mother was a divorced woman who didn't work, so we were poor. We lived in a house in an area of the Bronx. It's the West Bronx, and at that time it was a solidly Italian American Catholic neighborhood. Oh my God, we were Jewish on top of that. So here we go. I was Jewish. I was had a single parent. We were poor. My father, who had gone away, never sent money, so we were the renters. So this was the house I grew up in, and this was a picture taken a couple of years ago. It doesn't look much better. It was the ugliest house in the neighborhood. It was the rental house. So all my friends were middle-class girls who lived in these nice brick row houses, which I thought were fancy. A brick row house, boy, that was fancy. You owned it, that was fancy. So I had a religion, a mother, a house, a family that was sort of different, and I felt different. And I think when people sometimes say, we were poor, we never knew we were poor. I hate when people say that. You hear this from old people. I was poor as a kid, but I didn't know it. We didn't know it. Well, guess what? You didn't know it because you lived in a neighborhood where everyone was the same. But if you lived in the neighborhood where you're the only poor kid, the only Jewish kid, the only kid with a single mother, you knew you were different and you felt less than. So I felt isolated. I felt different, and my self-esteem absolutely suffered. I grew up feeling less than. On top of that, I was chubby and I had psoriasis. So it was kind of like, add a little bit more to the mix. On top of that, I wasn't a good student. I had an older brother that was brilliant, and I very much lived in his academic shadow. So everyone had low expectations of me. The good news is that spending a lot of time alone, I had become a very, very independent thinker and a very, very thoughtful young person, and a person who liked to read. And so I spent a lot of time thinking, and I had somewhere along the line become determined that I was going to get out of this. And I don't know if that's the Bronx tenacity or the lonely factor, but I knew I wasn't going to stay in this position. I was a little angry, so there was a little anger there. And I knew early on I was going to be better. So I was going to have more. And then how was I going to do that? My mother didn't work, but I had an aunt, Aunt Dorothy. Aunt Dorothy was a retired registered nurse, and she was not nice, actually. She was a terrible person. She was not kind. She was not warm. She was not fuzzy. She cheated at Scrabble. She stole food from our house. She looked down on my mother. But she was a registered nurse, and somehow she got away with all the crap that she put on the family, and everyone had just unquestionable respect for Aunt Dorothy. Aunt Dorothy would tell stories about her time in Monmouth Memorial Hospital in New Jersey, and I would be at rapt attention. I would listen to Aunt Dorothy. Aunt Dorothy would do something terrible, but then Aunt Dorothy, nobody ever called her on anything. Early on, by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I knew I wanted to be like Aunt Dorothy. Not that I wanted to be mean and ugly and hateful, but I was going to be a nurse, because if you were a nurse, people respected you and you could get away with anything. That was my first person, my first nurse in my life that made me realize maybe I want to be a nurse too. The next person in my life that was a nurse was my school nurse. So I went to this school where I was less than a stellar student and spent a lot of time alone, and I had a 4th grade teacher that tortured me. She hated me, and there were all teachers from hell, and that was the teacher from hell. In 4th grade, I decided I couldn't sit in the classroom anymore, and I wandered the halls. I ran away. I was a runaway for a while, and then I discovered Mrs. Bridgewater. Mrs. Bridgewater was the school nurse, and she, like me, was one of a kind. She was a black woman in a white school, and Mrs. Bridgewater invited me into her office, and I survived 4th grade and 5th grade in that school because of Mrs. Bridgewater, the black school nurse who welcomed the unfortunate loser of a 4th grade student who didn't want to be in school anymore. And she was my second person, and I realized that, wow, I respect her because she's compassionate and she's kind and she's good to me. That was the second nurse in my life. I was also by that time reading Cherry Ames and Sue Barton. I don't know, that's way before your time, but those were the heroes that we had. By the time I was 13, we moved out of that neighborhood, and my mother moved us into a Jewish neighborhood. Well, it was too late. I wanted to be Catholic by then. So it's like I had already spent my time going. I loved going to confession. It was my favorite activity on Saturday mornings. It was too late, but she moved us to a Jewish neighborhood near Montefiore. But the good news is that I already knew I was going to be a nurse, so I volunteered to be a candy striper, and so every Wednesday and Friday I was at Montefiore in my little pink and white, they don't make those anymore either, my little pink and white candy stripe outfit, and the deal was set. I was going to be a nurse. One last thing was a factor in that decision. I already knew I was going to be a nurse, even though I had terrible grades. By the time I was 16, my brother had had a horrible incident of having an untreated strep infection. And so he developed endocarditis. You're probably all learning about all this now, right? Endocarditis, and he ended up, this is so you take strep seriously. Endocarditis, he actually threw off embolisms. He had 2 aneurysms, and he ended up at New York Hospital for a year. He was the first person in the country to have cryosurgery. Very interesting. For me, I realized then that I was going to be a nurse because I also realized that the people who were the nurses and the doctors in that year that I spent visiting that hospital, they were the people that were in charge. They had the power, they were heroes, but they were also all powerful. They were the ones that came to work and had a good time at work and did wonderful things. And the patients were, again, in my life, in my young mind, I already was very aware of status. And so I knew that you could be disempowered because you were poor, or you could be disabled and disempowered because you were sick. And if you were a sick person in a hospital, you didn't have a say in what was going on. There's nothing more disabling than having all your choices taken away from you. You can't go to work, you can't do what you want, you may not live, you may not be the same. So I realized that there was an impotence, is what I like to say, in illness that was the same as the impotence of being poor. And I didn't want impotence in any form. I wasn't going to be a poor kid, and I was going to be the nurse. I'm determined I'm going to be a nurse. The problem was that I had never been a good student. So all through high school, I was in summer school. I never had a math course I passed my whole life, middle school on. Summer school was my best friend. I had terrible grades all through school, starting in elementary because it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I wasn't the bright kid in the family. Didn't matter, I was a girl. In those days, it didn't matter too much if you were a girl. I mean, things have changed so much. Not enough, but enough that it's different. So I was in high school and I was going to be a nurse, except that I had a C- average. My Regents courses were horrible. And when I sat with the guidance counselor my junior or senior year, whenever it was, it's too long ago to remember, and I said, I want to go to nursing school. I think she laughed. I think I remember her laughing. And I went home and I told my mother, and she said, well, she's right. Why don't you get a good job in Woolworths? I don't know. Anybody know what Woolworths? Why don't you get a good job in Woolworths, or learn how to type? And I said, I'm going to be a nurse. And I was determined. And so what I want to say is the one thing that came from all of that was that anger fueled me from early on, and that determination was there. And I don't care who said I couldn't be a nurse, and I don't care what reasons I couldn't be a nurse. I was going to be a nurse. I was determined. And that determination brought me to night school. And I spent a year in night school with English second learning people, with old people who thought they wanted to learn a new career, with other flunkies like myself. And after a year, I reapplied and I got into Bronx Community College School of Nursing. And that was the beginning of it. From that point on, it was a turning point. I had, through my determination, made it to nursing school, and there was no looking back. There was never looking back. I became a nurse. I went to nursing school. I graduated from that school with the highest GPA in the whole the whole school. I want to say that I was ambitious, and I want to read an excerpt from my first experience, my first clinical experience, because not only does it show my determination to be a nurse, it shows my ambition, and it shows my over-ambition. So a little hubris, but I want to read it because it's funny, and I think you'll relate to it. You've all been in clinical already? Okay. 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 Mrs. Connolly was the first real patient assigned to my care. The instructor furnished me with her history a day before our actual hospital day. I was anxious to get started and had artfully bypassed greeting the nurses quietly talking that morning. They didn't notice the arriving students. I hadn't listened to or registered a single word spoken by the reporting nurse. That was my first mistake of the day. I headed to my patient's room. I still had almost 10 minutes until I needed to meet up with my group. Enough time, I thought, to get a jump start. Her bed was one of 4 in the room. It was the one near the window. I could see the faded yellow privacy curtain pulled to near the foot of her bed. My patient sat up in an oversized orange vinyl hospital lounge chair and faced the view of a service entrance to a 2-story brick building. Sad view, I thought, but better than looking at the other 3 open-mouthed, shriveled, and sleeping roommates. I became aware of a dull, rhythmic whooshing sound. Whoosh, click, whoosh, click, whoosh, click. Oh, damn, I thought. She's connected to a ventilator. She's intubated. The sound continued and created fear and anxiety in me. I wasn't expecting a very sick patient. I was expected to know how to read, maintain, and operate any medical equipment that was presented, but all I'd been given the day before was a name and a laundry list of medical diagnoses. I had not concentrated enough on what nursing care and what skills might be required. I couldn't imagine being assigned a critically ill patient on a very first experience. I had spent hours reviewing disease processes and lab data. I knew about ventilators and IVs and trach tubes, but I never expected to need those skills on my very first day. My mind raced. I reviewed vent care, suctioning, settings on machines. An IV was hanging. Damn, I thought, she's really, really sick. What did her chart say about that? Maybe it's just a keep open line for meds, I hoped. Do your best, I thought. One step at a time. You know how to do this on a dummy, so just make believe that she's another dummy. Hi, Mrs. Connolly, I said, approaching her. How are you? My name is Miss Payne. She didn't look at me, and she didn't even move. The sound of the ventilator continued. Whoosh, click, whoosh, click, whoosh, click. Relentless rhythm. She didn't move, she didn't blink, she didn't respond. Good, you just go acting like a dummy and we'll both be fine, I thought. I wondered if she might be deaf. I thought maybe the sound of the machine made it hard for her to hear. So I moved closer and gently touched her pigeon claw of a hand. It was cool. No, cold, I thought. Her circulation was probably impaired. I spoke in a louder voice above the whoosh click. "So I'm just going to take your blood pressure, okay?" I asked. Whoosh click was the only response. I took my prized personal cobalt blue stethoscope out. I aligned the marker on the blood pressure cuff with her brachial artery. I pumped the bulb and listened carefully for the first pulse of the systolic pressure. Listening, listening. Whoosh click was all I heard. Darn ventilator, I thought. I couldn't hear anything. I palpated the crepey skin near the edge of the cuff. This stinks, I thought. Her veins are not even palpable, she's so cold. I decided to check her pulse instead. Radial, nothing. Carotid, nothing. I only heard the damn double whoosh click sound. I rubbed my still new and shiny circular diaphragm of the stethoscope. I admired my engraved initials. I thought that rubbing its surface would activate a sound. I imagined some simple malfunction that I'd missed. I placed it over her thin chest wall. I'll get an apical, I thought. There was no way I wouldn't hear that. But in fact, I could only hear the pounding of my own anxious heart. I considered just putting my ear to her chest. Now I was getting desperate. But I kept the stethoscope to her chest. Whoosh, click, lub-dub, lub-dub. Had I heard a lub-dub under the whoosh click? No, I heard nothing in those gray little earbuds feeding information to my brain. Nothing, nothing. Did she arrest? Is there a DNR? I listened once more, but there was only the whoosh click. Damn, I thought. She continued to stare out the window with unseeing eyes. I ran out the door in seconds into the nurses' station. The same 6 nurses were quietly looking over something. I managed to speak and blurt out, Mrs. Connolly, no pulse, no pulse, arrest, DNR? I couldn't form complete sentences. I breathlessly bleated senseless words. Help, quick, pulse. I moved around the small room and waved my useless stethoscope up and down to get their attention. The other nurses finally noticed me. They seemed expressionless and annoyed. All I could think of is, why are they so slow? I looked at them and felt like time was also slow. Everything was off kilter. It was a frozen frame and not the urgent reaction that I had expected. Mrs. Connolly expired at 6:47 a.m., one of them said. Had I bothered listening to them speaking at 7 a.m., I would have been spared the experience of ministering to a corpse. We are doing the paperwork now. Just leave everything in place. You better go and ask for another patient. So that was my first patient, and that's not made up. And it got better. And it got better, and I was always determined. And there it shows not only was I determined, I was overly determined. And I recovered, and I went on to a career, as Joyce recounted, of 50 years, all kinds of, Rikers was quite the trip too. So I did it, and I loved it. And I had made the choice to be a nurse, and it was the best choice I ever made. It was a choice that formed my identity, gave me self-esteem, a career which always fed my family well, and everything actually that I wanted in a career. I had the self-esteem, I thought, almost, that I wanted. But the little girl from the Bronx who really, really felt that she would never be as good as still lurked in there. So professionally, the choices I had made were wonderful. But on the other hand, I had made some choices personally that were misguided choices. I could never feel as good as anyone else. I had to have more. I had to have things. I had to have the life that I thought defined status. And so I married. And it wasn't a bad marriage. I was 21. I had 3 children who were lovely and grown, and I am a grandmother now. That all worked out okay. But I spent my life wanting more, and professionally, while everything was good, personally, everything was not good. I began a gluttonous behavior of wanting things, luxuries. I wanted the big house. So if you remember, this was the first house. I wasn't going to be happy until I had a house like it belonged right here in Bronxville, and it wasn't far, actually. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful Tudor, and it was furnished beautifully. And before I knew it, I was in trouble financially. There's a saying by a financial expert that says, and I think it defines what I was doing, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people that we don't even like. And that was me. It was like a house full of luxuries, and I thought I had everything I ever wanted, but I was actually feeling quite empty inside. My husband at that time was as driven and working, never home, and I was raising the kids and working full-time always. At that point, mostly nursing, home care nursing, and I was empty. And I was not only gluttonous about the things in my home I was collecting, I was gluttonous about food. I found myself, suddenly I was 50, I was fat, I was 50 pounds overweight. Work was my salvation, but you can't work all the time, and you don't want to work all the time. That's not a complete life. And so I found myself unhappy, and there was a sense to me of what I call existential angst. Does anyone sort of know what that is? Existential angst. If you have psych nursing, you'll learn it. But basically, it's a feeling that something is intrinsically wrong. I don't know what, but I got to get out of here. It's that I got a flee feeling, and I had that in my life. As soon as I got home, although I loved my children, I felt like that. So I joined a gym because what the heck, if you're not fat, then everything in your life is perfect, maybe. But it wasn't, far from it. And in that gym, I saw a sign that said, Boston to New York AIDS ride, 300 miles to benefit AIDS research and AIDS causes. And I signed up for it. Well, there I go again. There's that determined, stupid person. What right did a 50-year-old fat woman who was a nurse need to join a 300-mile bike ride? And I won't go into the training, but I did it. I did it. So here I am. I did it. I did those 300 miles that year, and I did another 300 miles the next year, and cycling has been my life since then. I cycle every day, weather permitting, and I spin in the winter otherwise. And I still eat too much, but that's another story. So that determination was there also for that. My first turning point in my life was when I went to nursing school. My determination brought me to nursing school, and that created my life of love for a profession. My second turning point was that bike ride. I just want to read, this kind of mirrors. I think I'm okay with time, yeah? No? Yeah? I don't know. I'll read it quickly, though. I can basically tell you about it. I went out on my bike. It was a $2,000 Italian Bianchi, because I was a glutton, and I wasn't going to buy a Schwinn when I could have a $2,000 road bike. So I bought this wonderful $2,000 bike, and I put on my spandex, and I felt that if you're sitting, your big fat rear end doesn't show, so that was good. And I went out on my first ride in my spandex on my beautiful green bike, and I had, if you cycle, the real good cyclists have the clip-in things, and I started off right with that, which was stupid, because I hadn't been on a bike since I was 10. And I went on that bike ride, and I went out my driveway, and I went in this, I had all the logos, the Italian olive oil and road cars, and it was like, I thought I was something else. I was going to do that ride. And I took my bike down the driveway, and it was downhill, it was fine. And then I realized I lived on a street that also went uphill. And so the bike and I, within 5 minutes, we were like wavering side to side. We were dancing. The bike and I were dancing, tangoing, sort of. And the bike threw me over. And within 5 minutes, I was back in my house with bloody knees, bloody shoulder, a very deflated ego, very deflated. Hung the bike up on the wall and said, I'm not looking at you again. But I went back to it because determination. That Bronx girl, that determined girl that was going to be a nurse, 50 years later, she was going to do that damn bike ride. And I did it. And so I went on that bike ride. And on that bike ride, the physicality of it and the just wearing me down made me realize that my life and all the things I owned and had and accrued were so meaningless. What was meaningful was what I could do on my own. And along that ride, I met the love of my life. And my love life is very much defined in that book, too, because now stripped down to who I was and what I loved in life, which is nature and challenge and beautiful things that had nothing to do with how much they cost. That was a second turning point in my life. And I'm going to just end this by saying that one of the quotes I also like, besides the one about finances, is one by Michel de Montaigne, who is a 14th century essayist. And one of my favorite quotes by him is, "The most important thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself. And so I feel that that was really what happened. That bike ride enabled me to belong to myself, to see not only was nursing a very, very big part of who I was and my identity, but there was another identity beside that I needed to discover. And that bike ride enabled me to discover that part of myself. So I think what I want people to get out of this memoir is that determination is important, believing in yourself is important, and sometimes, we all have to have a little Bronx. I don't care where you're from. I honestly have that would be my advice to anybody, and I'm sure not everybody in this room was born with a silver spoon in their mouth. There was 2 years in middle school where the kids all went to Catholic school, and I was in junior high school 142 in the Bronx. Does anyone know that school? Do you? I was the only white kid in that school. Wow, that was really being different then. All of it was good training for life. And so adversity, and whether it's a disadvantage and however you want to label disadvantage, it's only disadvantage if it's in your head. If it's in your head that you're disadvantaged and you're feeling sorry for yourself and you can't do it, you won't do it. But if you have that feeling that I will do it, I will overcome, I will be as much as anyone else. And it's not about the house. It's not about that at all. It's about believing in yourself and belonging to yourself. And I hope that you will maybe enjoy the book. It's full of nursing treasures. It really is. That's it. Anybody have any questions? Nursing or otherwise, questions, welcome.
Hi, do you have any advice for us?
I think it's that you have to be in competition with yourself. And that's a lesson for me all through life. I'm still insecure. I think we're all insecure. The insecurity is just part of, life. And so I think in nursing school, I had classes I hated. I hate organic chemistry. I hated a lot of things. I loved the clinical the best. And so if you're somebody that has a bad memory and maybe A&P, you're probably past A&P already, right? And all that stuff. Organic chemistry, God, I was almost at the point where I thought I'm going to drop out. Compete with yourself. Just do a little better each time. And remember the prize at the end. The prize at the end is someone who's telling you that there's no better career in the world than nursing, because you can do anything with nursing. Nursing is 100 careers within a career. You don't like one thing, you do the other. You don't want to work at Rikers Island. That's tough. You don't want to work labor and delivery. You want to work in a doctor's office, plastic surgery. I have somebody I met the other day that's the nurse on the set of Saturday Night Live. What gets better than that? Travel nursing. It is a world that will give you every opportunity, part-time, full-time. I went to nursing to work as a school nurse because I thought, this is good. My kids are in school. This is an easy little job. It's not an easy little job. It wasn't an easy little job at all. I saw such a variety of illnesses and heartbreaking things. My advice is to stay with nursing no matter what you have to do to stay here and finish, whatever it takes. If you have to repeat a course, repeat a course. We have a daughter that just graduated from nursing school, Massachusetts General, and she had to repeat a course, and she hates when I say that. She had to repeat a course. She failed it, and she had to repeat it. And if she had to repeat it again, she was out. And we just sat on her. We said, you have to do it. You have to be a nurse. And I never met a nurse that was ever sorry. I've met teachers that said if they had to do it again, they wouldn't. Does anyone have nurses in their family? Yeah. Has any of them ever said they wouldn't do it? No. So there you go. That's my advice. Compete with yourself. Grammar school, PS 68 in the Bronx. Yeah. And it was, a nice Italian Catholic neighborhood. It was not easy. It's not easy to be different. And even if the difference is that you're not the brightest student in your class here, it's okay.
Were you accepted by your peers?
I had a couple of friends, but they all went to Catholic school. See, in middle school, what happened was, this fellow in the back that knows junior high school 142, the Edenwald housing project came up around that time. And so it was a low-cost housing project. So all the Italian Catholic kids went to Catholic schools. And my mother said, well, now you're Jewish. And I said, well, really, no. And she said, really, yeah, you're not going to the Catholic school. You're going to go to 142. So I went to the school that was, let me just say one more thing. I like to use her as an example. Sonia Sotomayor is a Bronx girl, and I call it the Sonia Sotomayor factor. So Sonia is a girl that lived in the same neighborhood. She went to, was it Spelman, Cardinal Spelman? And Sonia was a Latina in a neighborhood that wasn't all Latino. She was a chubby, diabetic kid, and she had a lonely childhood. And look where she went. All I'm saying is, when I hear her speak and I read her memoir, do you know what the one word she uses is to describe why she is a Supreme Court justice and other people died of drugs or didn't become famous? Determination. If you listen to her speak, she says it's determination. She was determined. And so there you go. That's that.
You need an inspiration for that anyway.
I had no inspiration. My inspiration was driven from the fact that I was, I think, a little angry, and I felt like anger was my fuel. You know, anger can go either way. It can be a good thing or a bad thing. For me, the anger fueled my determination. I was going to have more and be more.
Barbara, I want to just speak for a second about what, I think you mentioned, or we talked at one point, what was sort of, what the driving force for you to finish your book or to get your book written.
I think that the driving force for writing the book was really to validate, and in many ways it was to validate the total experience. It was, I was still angry. I still have residual anger. I mean, I don't know if we spoke about that, but the book starts off with an angry woman on the platform of some train station here in the Metro North, and I'm looking at a rich woman dressed beautifully, and I'm in my clogs and jeans, which is usually how I dress, and I'm feeling a little put off by her. There's always this little bit of anger, and I started writing it as essays, and the essays turned out to be tributes to nurses and anger at rich people. It was back and forth, back and forth. And I had to reconcile the fact that for the 25 years, this was mostly it, the 25 years of school nursing, I worked at White Plains, which is a lovely mixed community of people, in every way mixed, socioeconomically, racially, culturally. And in the summer, I worked in a rich kids camp in northern Westchester with entitled parents. And I had a hard time with that. I had a hard time, because I'm from the Bronx maybe, I had a hard time keeping my mouth shut when people were condescending to me. I had a hard time thinking that a gluten allergy was as bad as a glioblastoma. You know, it was that kind of bouncing back and forth for me. And so I began to write because I still had anger at the discrepancies and the disparity that I see and I still see every day. I'm still a little angry, but even today I'm angry politically now. You know what? I channel that. You know, I channel it, whatever your political, you know, issues are. I have residual anger, but I embrace it. I do, and I actually, and I'm going to end this with this. I'm going to read this to you because basically it's the way I ended my book. I like my last vestiges of the Bronx edge. They keep my juices flowing. So what if I never yield to a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW at a four-way intersection? It is like the thickened scar left on your knee from a nasty fall before you were really good on that two-wheeler. You rub it unconsciously sometimes because it will always be there. It's not pretty, but it's yours. And I have to say that that residual, I have to be aware of it. Can't go saying bad things to people, but that little bit of anger can be a driving force. So, thank you. Thank you.